I find it silly to believe that the actors in that system should reside somewhere in a nation state. It is bonkers. I don't want to see that. I'm here to prevent that from happening because you can never code the world. It's just simply impossible. Code is law, and on the back is beyond. So we go beyond code is law. This is why I feel very strongly about DeFi. It's the killer application, and it's going nowhere.
I'm here with Nicolas Biagosch, who's the co-initiator at the Q protocol. Q is a really interesting idea that I think a lot of people don't talk about in the space. Like, we talk a lot about DeFi and other products that try to revolutionize finance, but governance is an interesting and important aspect of blockchains. And coming from the Cosmos side, of course, like, people are familiar with the idea of governance, but also its problems. And so Q is building a really interesting system for resolving some of the issues with governance, notably the dispute resolution side of governance. And so I'll be talking to Nicolas today about Q and how it resolves some of these issues. Nicolas, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You have a legal background. And you spent some time also leading companies. I think you were a telco executive before. Tell me a little bit more about your background and how you decided to focus your time on solving governance in blockchains.
Sure. So my background is law and business. I was trained as a lawyer in Germany and the United States. I was trained for business at London Business School and in life. So I started with first business in the Web 1 craze in the late 90s. I was in San Francisco at the time. I then went into telecoms after that Web 1 bubble had burst, and I had to lick my wounds a little bit. So was on the board of a big telco company doing a lot of M&A and regulation, other things. Then I was a CEO of a mobile company for a couple of years, and when that was sold to Telefonica, I set up shop with my then CFO Martin, who's today the other co-initiator of Q, and we did a couple of things in Web 2 and then Web 3, starting around like 2016, early 2016. And so I always had this background of doing innovation in business. I never really worked as an attorney on the edge of business and law and governance and legal stuff. Martin's background is full-blown finance, and so I always had to do a lot. To do with governance. And in Web 3, we came to realize, having been early investors in Maker, amongst other things, how important governance really is also for the decentralized space. So when I discovered Bitcoin, for me it was such a revelation. It was like the missing piece. I got into Web 1 in the first place before this promise of decentralizing information and democratizing the space, and then this whole thing turned into a couple of big monopolies, mostly US based, which I didn't like very much to see. And one of the reasons was because there was no way to really monetize it natively, and then Bitcoin came along and I was like, bang, this is it. Now we can. This was kind of the missing piece. And then starting in investment in Maker, we realized a couple of things. One was, everything that you can code is amazing and should be coded, but not very many questions in life and business are binary. Most questions, way over 90%, are discretionary. They require some kind of interpretation. They're non-deterministic. So what do you do with those? And we've seen it with with block size wars. That was a governance war, and that was the resolution was the biggest voice won, essentially. So it was a big shouting match. We've seen it with the original Ethereum DAO hack. That was a governance decision where the Ethereum community, and nobody really knew who that was at the time, decided to sacrifice one proposition, transaction security, over the second proposition, smart contract capability, and rolled back the chain and thereby, so that was governance. And Maker, we saw we were totally fascinated by DeFi, still are, but we saw at least two problems. One was if the community is supposed to do all of the decision making, most of the system critical questions in DeFi and other businesses require some kind of expertise, and the crowd or the community is very, very bad at these kind of decisions. So
yeah,
it's
I think I agree on that last part, and I think that we've seen this in Cosmos tons of times, right, with governance proposals becoming very politically charged. And I think that if you take social media and on-chain governance and sort of crowd governance, and you put those three things together, you get this decision-making process that ultimately is about who is the loudest,
yes,
who can be the most obnoxious, rather than sound decision-making. And I think a lot of people observing the crypto space or even in the crypto space recognize this. But there seems to be, and this kind of come back to your initial point, this idea, this sort of religious idea with crypto, that all governance decisions must be binary, and there is no discretionary aspect. But there is discretionary aspects, right? And they happen on social media, and they happen in governance forums, and they happen in conversation. But that the final decision making coming on chain has to be like a binary or executable by code. And I think we have thousands of years of, maybe not thousands, but 2,000 years of governance decisions in society, democracy, etc., that didn't operate under this scope. But all of a sudden, with blockchains, we have this idea that everything. Do you know where that comes from in crypto? This concept that all decisions must be sort of executed by the code, this governance by code idea.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons is because the space is really heavily tech driven. It's blockchain is a technology, although it's not only code. It's a combination of economics and technology and so forth. So, but a lot of the space has this tech driven mindset of we need to think about the world and the future of the world today, and we need to find the place where we want to go to, and then because only then you can code it. There's this thing called incomplete contracts theorem, which some guy called Hart got a Nobel Prize for, where he mathematically proved that it is impossible to comprehend all future stages of the world, and that's why every contract, and a code is contract, that's why we call it smart contracts, will always be incomplete, because you can never code the world. It's just simply impossible and that is just a mathematical reason why you can't do it. And then there are many others, because how would you code emotions and that forth. I have another view on that. People who come from that background, they don't like politics, they don't like this interaction with people, this situation where not everything has a yes or no answer, where the answer is it depends, our lives. The consequence, I found it interesting to think about the consequence of if we were able to code everything. What would that end up to? That would be a totalitarian nightmare, essentially. It would be horrible, because everything would be planned, and there would be no free will, no nothing. And so I don't like that idea at all. I do like the idea to code whatever we can code, and I hope that we will be able, and I'm absolutely convinced we will be able to code more and more and more and take out insufficiencies and risk and such, but everything else, it's impossible. And that's the other thing, it's like we said, like, as long as you don't have an alternative for the solution of a shouting game to be the only governance or dispute resolution mechanism in a blockchain scenario, we're limited to below 10% of the capabilities and of the opportunities.
Can you point to some practical cases where DAO governance has catastrophically failed? I'm thinking, there's this Uki DAO case that I'm not super familiar with, but I think you are. And then there's obviously like the Aragon thing that happened like late last year. Wondering if you have if those are relevant examples in your view, and if you have others in mind.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of a party trick where I challenged the crowd to throw like any hack or disaster or failure in the last 2 years at me, and I will explain how it's been a governance hack in whatever sort. So like Aragon is an obvious one. What's the problem with Aragon? And that's a fundamental structural problem in the whole space. The idea is to protect a value, let's say like a Aragon treasury or the TVL of a DeFi system or whatever, a value, let's say, of 100 by a token that's worth only 15, market cap 15. That's an obvious attack vector. I mean, Martin, my co-initiator, has written about that in our white paper in 2019. Vitalik has talked about this with respect to Maker in 22 at length. So it's a widely known factor, and it's nowhere else ever in history has that. It would be like trusting the eyes of your bank manager to not run with the money instead of like the system behind it. But everybody still believes like, yeah, we need to solve this alone. Like fragmentation is another big problem of that. So that was the Aragon case. If you look into into their blog post, why they decided to dissolve their foundation and then like leave the decentralized space is they said like we couldn't set up a system including human judgment. I mean, that's what we're doing at Q with including the ICC and all of these things. B, transaction costs. So they couldn't do on-chain voting, which I think is paramount. Snapshot is great, but it's a crux. It's a tool. It's not what it should. Like voting should be on-chain. And then the third thing was exactly that. They were missing an external, credibly neutral security anchor for their treasury and governance. So that's one. Uki DAO, another super interesting one. So the Uki DAO case, what the takeaway for many people is like there was a California judge who decided that all DAOs are going to be everybody's responsible for everyone in the DAO.
So the unlimited liability.
Yeah, the unlimited liability and part of that. And if you look into that, and if you have a little bit of a legal background, what happened is the following. So a California judge, the first question a judge always asks is, do I assume jurisdiction over this case? Do I take this case? So here, in the absence of any kind of contract, rules, whatever, this like description of what that DAO actually is, that judge decided to say like, well, that's a California resident who's suing, so I have to assume jurisdiction. So what we do like for the Q DAO and what we offer to others is like a contract, which we call Constitution, you could call it whatever, which is a private contract amongst all members of the DAO. So there you have something where a judge would look into and say like, what am I dealing with? here. And that contract would say, like, we are the DAO and blah, blah, blah. This is how we do things. And another thing our constitution includes, and others could include as well, is an integration with the ICC. So that concept is coming from from like international trade, or I was in telecoms, international roaming. So you have international parties that can agree on the terms of the trade, like American and Chinese can agree on the terms of the trade, but they can never really agree on the jurisdiction. The Chinese won't go into the US or otherwise to beef out their dispute. So they came up with this idea of private arbitration. And the ICC and some others, like this ICC being the biggest one, they are being recognized by all relevant courts around the world. So that judge in the US would have said, had he seen a contract or like a constitution, including the ICC for a dispute resolution mechanism, guys, I'm not assuming jurisdiction, it's like, go beef it out before the ICC, and then you can come back and I will happily enforce arbitral award of the ICC, because that's what then nation, state, or local courts do. So that's what happened. It's not that that judge was on a mission to determine all DAOs being whatever, and the other thing what happens is, like, if they don't have any, they have to tap into their toolbox. They have to use the tools given to them by the law. And the DAO wasn't anything he knew, but a private contract, including the ICC. That would have been something that guy would have known.
So essentially, in this case, what takes place is that because there is no contract, there is no binding agreement between the DAO members, the judge presiding over a dispute looks at what he has in front of him and says, okay, there's no contract, and then defaults back to a standard partnership, I guess it is in the law, right? And the standard partnership is sort of defined in the law as having like these characteristics, and where every person has unlimited liability. And then the other thing is that anytime there's like a member of the DAO who's a resident of a country or a state or any jurisdiction, that person immediately becomes the judge can then claim jurisdiction over that. So basically what you're saying here is that with Q, well, one, there's a contract, and so we can define the terms of the contract and also the jurisdiction in which disputes would be resolved. So for instance, in this case, private arbitration, and then the jurisdiction also falls on whatever arbitrary body is defined in the contract.
Yes, and the beauty of private arbitration is that you have a lot of options that you can choose from. So you can choose the law applicable to the proceedings, you can choose the law applicable to the subject matter or to the substance of the case. You could even choose for the contract to be the law and nothing else, which we did for Q, because we believed that we had to be neutral as possible. So we are independent of any nation, state, or country, or whatever. And the partnership in the law is kind of like a catch-all clause. It's like a fallback, If it's not this, if it's not that, well, then it's got to be something. So it's a partnership, But had it been like a contract, like a private contract, this happens, and this is so customary in like international trade, as I said, like in telecoms, global roaming agreements. It's the same thing. It's nothing really new, It's like blockchain. It's a good combination of things that are tried and tested.
Yeah, and blockchains being inherently, global systems, it makes sense for blockchains, perhaps to adapt and adopt their contractual or sort of like legal structure to something that's been tried and tested in international business and sort of international commerce for decades. Let's come back to the Constitution in a few minutes. I'd like to, because we've talked a lot about the context here, but what is Q? What is it exactly, and like who is it for? And at the end of the day, like what problem does it solve for the people using it?
Yeah. So Q is a decentralized comprehensive governance framework for Web3. That means we provide all three elements of governance in an integrated way. So governance requires always at least three elements: rule setting, enforcement, and dispute resolution. If you just have one or two of those, it's not governance. It's a part of governance, but it's not governance. So you need all three of them, and they need to be integrated. They need to work together in an integrated way. So if you look at binary questions, smart contracts, they are beautiful governance systems because the code is the rule. That's the rule. It's transparent, it's open, it's clear. Then the enforcement is automatic, and there are never any disputes because it's just yes or no. But
that's convenient.
Yeah, that's very convenient, but it's very limited, as we've seen with the block size wars, with the Ethereum original DAO hack, with all the problems in DeFi, with like tiny things like you could have like a beautifully decentralized code base, but then the code needs an upgrade and you end up with 3 out of 5 guys with admin keys. And that's where regulation comes into place, because regulation says like, well, I don't care about the technology. You can't fool me. I'm looking at the whole thing. And if I see 3 guys with admin keys, those guys are going to grab, period. Regulation is very pragmatic that way. So that's what we're doing. We're providing these 3 elements in a framework. So you can set your rules either in code or human language. Combine that with a human written contract. We provide an enforcement mechanism that is able to enforce not only code, but also human written language that can assume some scope of discretion or discretionary decision making if you wish for them to do so. And then there's on the dispute resolution, we've integrated with the ICC, and they are willing and able to see any kind of dispute that arises within the Q system, or if an application using the governance chooses to opt into the ICC as well.
Okay.
It's an open system, so anybody can build on it. So DAO tooling can build on it. Even like other dispute resolution mechanisms. So Claros is a great dispute resolution for a specific part of dispute resolution and a specific case. So that could be combined. And it's for anyone in Web3, anyone who wants to have a truly decentralized, autonomous organization, or partly, it's like you could also have what we call hybrid models, where you combine centralized and decentralized decision making.
Would you say that Q enables blockchain governance to step outside the confines of binary decisions?
Yes. So our like, if you've ever seen me in my swag, it says like code is like here, like code is law, and then it's and on the back is beyond. So we go beyond code is law.
Okay.
We like code as law. It's not that we don't like it, but we need to go beyond it. So we provide this as a, think about it or another way to think about it is the following. Like Cosmos, Ethereum, others are providing shared transaction security, right? We provide shared governance security. And that way, not only are you able to have an incredibly neutral external security anchor for your governance, but also you are able to combine deterministic decision-making, transaction-based decision-making with non-deterministic decision-making, which essentially opens up the decentralized world for pretty much all relevant business models. I mean, there's a reason why we have not seen more innovation in DeFi. There's a reason why we've not seen more traditional businesses and companies tapping into blockchain. The reason is governance. They don't understand the governance. They can't go fully decentralized. Their business models are way too complex for them to be binary. So that's how we see ourselves as adding that part to the space.
And another way to put this, maybe a little bit facetious, but like Q enables blockchains to rely, at the end of the day, blockchains can fall back on the guy with the gun. Right? It was like enforcement is, at the end of the day, is like a guy with a gun, sort of
Yes,
with
and
the like enforcing state violence on
it's
monopoly on violence. Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting. I've never thought about it like that, right? But it's interesting because like enforcement was and is one of our absolute main focuses. In the intro, you said dispute resolution, that too, but those are others doing it as part of the system, like the ICC, like Claros, like enforcement is something that we're really concentrating and focusing on because we've seen other attempts like EOS had a constitution. I think they were the first ones with a constitution, but there was no enforcement, and the outcome was remarkable, to say the least. So it's like you need enforcement. Without enforcement, there's nothing. I mean, you look at Arbitrum. I really admire what these guys are doing, or at Eigenlayer. It's like Eigenlayer is even like almost a better case, like slashing. No slashing, no Eigenlayer, ultimately.
Yeah.
If we don't find a way to enforce into the assets, then the staking is worth nothing. The risk or the security doesn't come from the fact that assets had been staked. Security comes from the fact that there's an effective enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, but like enforcement by slashing, I think it works in some. It works for some use cases, but I don't think that at scale it's a very capital efficient means of enforcement. Because like if all contracts were just enforced by some kind of financial penalty where you had to put up capital in order to enter any sort of agreement, we'd be in a very like capital efficient world where you would have like all this money basically locked up for for the possibility of an enforcement of a governance decision. I want to talk about the Constitution a little bit more. So tell us about like what is the Q Constitution? What form does it take? Like, I mean, I read it on the website. I think it's pretty cool that like there's the Constitution there, you can read it. But how does it actually create a binding agreement when participants are using Q to enter some sort of agreement?
Yeah. So the Q Constitution is the rules that govern the Q protocol, and in at times really meticulous detail, it lays out things like fundamentals, like maximum numbers of tokens, how the governance works. Like all kinds of things that are relevant. So we switch from code is law to law is law, like constitution is law. So in Q, the technology is following the constitution. We would have to change the constitution first in order to change the technology. The beauty of that, however, is that the system has a very rigid, transparent process to change the technology and cater towards innovation. So like we did last year, we did the first constitution rule-based hard fork probably in history. So it's very clearly laid out, and that way we can always determine what is the correct version of Q. Same with contracts, like smart contracts. It defines the stakeholders and their rights. There are tables in there for voting, like, for example, the Q token holders are the ultimate owners and bearers of risk of that system, and they're the ultimate decision makers for changes to the constitution, like fundamental changes. So they need like a supermajority, and then they have delegated some of their powers to independent bodies, which is a very smart move, because they understood that they are not the experts on everything. So there are expert panels in Q, and it's as a function you can use that. and set up your expert panel to facilitate non-deterministic decision making. There are oversight mechanisms and panels, like for example the root nodes, and that is all in the Constitution. The Constitution is a private contract between all members and stakeholders of the system. So if you become a root node, you have to sign the Constitution. And as always in life, this is not bulletproof, so you will find a jurisdiction in the world where somebody would say, like, this is not a valid legal contract on the basis of my national laws for whatever reason, but it is very clear. It is optional, so you can opt in or not. So it's a private contract. And
that's also one thing I wanted to ask you is the binding nature of these contracts. Like I've sold company shares in Germany, for example, and found out that nothing is binding unless it's like signed on paper in front of a notary, somewhere in a Frankfurt Tower. And so there are these sort of particularities about certain jurisdictions and what constitutes a legal binding agreement. How broadly does the Constitution cover national jurisdictions, individual, legal particularities, I'd say?
The way we've dealt with that is that you will not find any obligations of Q token holders in the Constitution that are that could be widely regarded as consumer, like under consumer protection laws, because that would then prevent the binding nature. You will not find that. You will find a lot of inter-professional or company-related dealings, like with root nodes or with validators or others. So that's one way we've dealt with that, for this to be widely regarded a valid contract. Then there are rules that are widely regarded for international contracts that are independent of nation-state contractual law, the UNIDROIT rules and so forth. So we've tried to observe those. There will never be like a perfect solution, because and it's very obvious. I mean, think about taxes. It's different everywhere. The way I look at this is the following. If we believe that there's going to be a decentralized or at least digital global economy that continues growing like we see it today in the internet and then in our crypto space or Web3 space, if we believe that's going to continue, then I find it silly to believe that the actors in that system should reside somewhere in a nation state. It is bonkers, excuse me, but it's really silly, because like the answer to the question where will always be wrong. Why Switzerland? Why China? Why the US? So we will need an alternative for those who act and move in that space, who don't have any national relationship or don't have people on the ground only there, or have to deal with other companies on the ground somewhere. Otherwise, the question is, well, otherwise I believe what will happen is the following. This beautiful idea of decentralized blockchains and decentralized infrastructure will essentially be very, very centralized, because it will be pulled back into regional nation-state legal systems, and that's it. That will be it. Then it's just a little more efficient technical infrastructure. That's what a lot of the traditional finance industry would love to see, by the way, for blockchain to be a horribly boring settlement layer for TradFi. I don't want to see that. I'm here to prevent that from happening. That's,
Let's talk about the different stakeholders here. Who are the different participants of the Q blockchain, and what are their roles?
Yeah. So essentially, there are four main stakeholders. We have built this as a layer one, not because we want to be layer one. We are implementing cross-chain governance at the moment, so this is available to anyone in Web3. We did, however, build it as a layer one because that's the only way that you can establish the required governance security. You couldn't do that on a layer two, or especially not on an application. And we wanted to be neutral, so that's why we built it as a layer one. But given cross-chain capabilities, it's available to anyone. So we have, it's an EVM-compatible DPoS system, so we have validators, state-of-the-art, nothing really fancy there. Then those validators, and there it gets a little more interesting, are overseen by a second set of full nodes that are very independent in that everything is different for those. They don't validate any blocks and transactions and so forth, which we call root nodes. And their job is to oversee the validators and other stakeholders in the system on the basis of the Q Constitution, and they can also do that for other applications. So the root nodes is the second biggest stakeholders. Then there are expert panels. So you, as I said, you can choose to use one of the existing expert panels, or choose to set up your own expert panels, and you can subject those expert panels to the oversight of the root nodes. You can give those expert panel rules within which, in order to define the scope of discretion within which they can then decide and so forth. And then ultimately the Q token holders, which is the community, everybody who owns Q tokens. And they are probably, by the end of the day, the most important, because they ultimately own the system. They make sure it's decentralized, and they have to take the decisions on everything. They're a very important part in the governance.
How do the token holders, how do they have such an important role? Because when I was reading the paper and everything, it felt to me like this could have been built as a proof of authority chain, sort of a, with a set of validators that were handpicked and, professional. Like I don't immediately see the need to have an external community of token holders. I guess like it comes down to the utility of the token, maybe.
Yeah. So the idea behind it is that if you interact with Q, if you use the governance of Q, you do that by way of the Q token, and you pay governance fees for that, and you do the voting and so forth. So everybody using Q will become a Q token holder and part of the community. And we thought about about this like a country. It's like a society. You have a society comes together. Those are the applications who decide to use the same shared governance infrastructure and security, and they must be the ultimate owners of that system. So it's like the people of a country should own the country, and they should then be able to decide, well, we're going to build roads, we're going to have a legal system, we're going to do this and that, but they should be the ones to decide how that should ultimately be, because it needs to be designed to their needs and not anybody else's. So that's why they need to be such an important part of the decision making ultimately. And then there could be also like others who are using these systems, which would be then not the project themselves, but the users. So I'm going into a country like France, and I want to use the infrastructure of France because I love the country and I love what's offered in France. If I do this regularly, I might want to have a say in this, and not just be a visitor. And that's the idea how we thought about this, and why we believe that the Q token holders are ultimately so important. Because it's not like a random community. It is It is the ones using the governance. It's the ones using the applications that are offering their services.
But anyone can buy the Q token on the market, right? I mean,
Yes, at this moment, I mean, we're about to list the token publicly. At this moment, the token is available, but not on the open market. But you could do that as well, of course, yeah.
okay.
And it's important to further decentralize the system. You need, and that's also like, you might have seen we have a function, the QID
Yeah.
holders. So that is a function where we are implementing a corrective mechanism, like one person, one vote, as a corrective mechanism for one token, one vote, which it ultimately could lead to plutocracy and like all of these things that come with that one voting scheme. So it resembles a lot these ideas of having a society, and then those acting in the society and being interested and part of the society should have a say in that.
Okay, and maybe we'll just zoom into the difference between the validators and the root nodes. So I guess the validators are running the blockchain, like producing blocks. How are they different from the root nodes in their particular role in the
Yeah,
chain?
so first of all, validators can be anonymous. They can buy themselves into the relevant set. It's a fully open system. They're not selected by anyone. Root nodes have to be known by name and place of residence. They are voted into the system by the Q token holders. They cannot buy themselves. They will still have to put down stake. They then validators receive rewards depending on the amount of stakes, just standard. Root nodes will always receive the same rewards, so rewards will be cut equally between the root nodes. So there can never be an overweight of one root node. The stake might be very different for various reasons we can go into, but they will always have one root node, one vote, and have not a bigger. They can also be slashed, just like validators, but they don't have any other interest than observing the rules of the Q Constitution, and that is secured by 4 layers in order to make this panel utmost independent and decentralized. So the first layer is root nodes must be dispersed over territory or regions. So we have root nodes in all 6 continents. So that, for example, if the US shuts down all things of blockchain, Q will still survive because we have root nodes in all continents and all kind of jurisdictions. Second layer would be the segment they work in. So we make sure, or there is a rule where a root node has to add to the independence of the panel by being in different segments. So we have lawyers, we have academia out of MIT, New York Stern, Toulouse School of Economics, famous one. Then we have Deutsche Telekom being a root node, so corporates. So there you have another discrete. The third layer is that none of them being a root node is their main job. So they not only risk being slashed, but they also risk their main job, like Deutsche Telekom. If they do something wrong as a root node, they can be sued before the ICC, and then this could be enforced on the ground in Bonn, in the headquarters of Deutsche Telekom in Germany. So, or for a professor or legal personnel. So there are these different layers, and then that ensure that they're independent in themselves, and especially very independent from the validators, incentive mechanisms, influence, and everything.
Is it like a 2-tiered governance system where you have kind of like an upper house and a lower house? Is that like a good way to maybe look at it?
Definitely. So the distribution of powers was one very important aspect when setting up this. So you can define, I'm taking the perspective of somebody integrating with Q and defining their own governance. You can define all kinds of levels. So if you set up your DAO, you could have sub-DAOs with certain decision-making powers, and those can be overseen by others, and then there could be an external oversight, which would then be root nodes, like a referee or like the police, like you give them the rules and they execute or enforce these rules no matter what. You kick somebody in the head on the pitch, you go back and leave the pitch, because that's not what we do. And somebody else gets to kick a penalty, stuff like that. And yeah, that's definitely one way to think about it.
Okay. And what's the role of expert panels? Because you mentioned those earlier, and I'd want to.
Yeah. So expert panels, I mean, we've talked about this earlier, how the crowd is really bad at taking decisions that require some sort of expertise. Like for a health insurance, the crowd could not decide whether a tooth had to be pulled, right?
Yeah.
Or stuff like that. And so that's what you need expert panels for. So you can have, we have a decentralized, like a MakerDAO clone essentially on the chain, and they have an expert panel, and their job is to determine collateralization or over-collateralization ratios, risk parameters, questions like what's an eligible asset to be borrow against, stuff like that. Things that the crowd is really bad at making. You can define those expert decisions to be binding. You can define the scope of discretion for those, or you could define those expert to just to prepare a discussion, or because sometimes very small things can have a profound impact. So if you look into decision making in big corporations, for example, the one of the elements that differentiate good versus not so good decision making is the preparation of a decision. Did I look into all the relevant aspects, which the crowd is really bad at because they come up with all kinds of aspects. 90+% are not relevant and should not be regarded in a decision. Did I look at alternatives, because you all can only have a decision if you do have an alternative. Many are not even discussing alternatives. The crowd is mostly discussing tiny nitty-gritty things, but not even thinking about is this the only way to go, or could there be a better alternative, and so forth. So that's what expert panels are for, or can be used for.
Okay, so if we summarize here, the Q token holders are electing the root nodes are monitoring the validators are securing the chain and sort of executing on the constitution. Coming back to this wisdom of the crowd idea, if Q token holders are electing root nodes, what gives them competence to elect root nodes? Isn't there sort of a contradictory issue here where we acknowledge that that the crowd is not always best at making decisions? What if they're electing bad root nodes?
So the crowd, that is a decision that I think the crowd is actually good at. What defines neutral, and then come up with rules that as I said, there's an algorithm defining how a root node would add to the integrity of the root node panel and the independence of the root node panel. So that the crowd can do. They can look at can we see an address? Is that a couple of facts? And do we already have a root node in that jurisdiction? That's an easy decision to make for the crowd. Do we believe that a professor has a certain independence over somebody who has a business interest, which is also fine, but then they would have to come up with more stake, for example. I mean, we also have investors in the Q as root nodes, so they're obviously biased, but that's not a problem if it's transparent and you cater to that. So they had to put up a lot more stake than others, like a professor out of MIT that can lose everything. For them, reputation is everything, and not money.
Yeah,
so I think that is actually a decision that the crowd is pretty good at making. because it doesn't require domain expertise.
So let's talk about like a practical case here. Like let's say we had a DAO that was using Q that had adopted Q's constitution and governance system enforcement, etc. Now there's a decision that is put forth for vote. Now that decision between the DAO token holders comes to a dispute that then goes to an arbitration court, and the arbitration court makes a decision which then has to be enforced. Can you walk us through like the different sort of steps to get between each of these steps? Like how does that work, and at which point do, I guess, like if you're coming from a blockchain governance perspective where like things are voted on and then executed, like what are the mechanisms that stop the automatic execution, say, of transfer of funds for there to be, you know, a potential like dispute if someone is not agreeing with the decision of governance or something like that?
Yes. Okay. So let's say the scenario is the following: you had a DAO, you have an expert panel or some kind of decision within the DAO, and that decision did require some kind of interpretation. So you set a scope of discretion by way of rules, and then what could happen, and there are many ways, but like one way we've implemented with some partners is where you take an optimistic approach and say like, well, we trust the decision of the DAO until it's being contested by a DAO member. So once that happens, then this decision is sent to the Q governance system. In this case, could be the root nodes, and they are then looking at the decision. They are looking at whether a decision had been made according to the rules, like majority requirements and so forth, preventing that you kind of sneak in a big decision as a small decision, which is like one of the like big problem if you don't have enforcement. Then they can look at whether have they decided within the scope of discretion, like have they observed those rules, and if they find, well, everything's been fine, then they would then they would enforce the transaction. Or the other way around, if the root nodes found for the decision not to be having to be made in like within the system rules, then they can veto that transaction and send it back, and then the decision would have to be made again. So vetoing could be one element to do that. You could also, another way could be to have a second opinion. So that decision would then go to an independent expert panel that sits on Q, and they could either have a second opinion, enabling a second thought or a second voting, or be binding. It's like we leave it to an external. There are all kinds of ways to do this, but Q would then step in and prevent harm from happening before the fact, which is important on blockchain, because you can't run after your money, really, right?
Yeah.
So then what you could then have as a second step is then this decision could be contested, or that would be a second different scenario. So you have a decision, somebody contests that, takes it to dispute resolution renders an arbitral award, and now the root nodes come into place because they function as an oracle in that situation. So they are able to take this arbitral award, this real world event, and they are able to then enforce it on chain. So they can act as a credibly neutral oracle for these off-chain events. That's how they could come in. Treasury decisions, or like say a very simple one that applies to a lot of applications in DeFi and others, L2s, big challenge in L2s, system contract upgrades. So you might have a decision of the community, but then you have 3 guys with admin keys who have to execute that and deploy that on chain, and there you have the weakest link in the chain of decentralization. And the root nodes could be those. We do this for Q all the time. So last year we have done 47 contract upgrades without any admin keys, fully decentralized. We received regulatory clearance 2 years ago in Germany and Liechtenstein, and that was their very last question. How, like, do you have any admin keys in your system? And only when we could show them how we do these things without any admin keys in a fully decentralized way, that's when we received regulatory clearance. So that's what we could do. Could be another, like, code upgrades without any admin keys. You know.
Okay. So how do applications or DAOs or even chains, like in the case of a Cosmos chain, how would they utilize Q? Would they have to build their DAO on Q, or can Q sort of sit as a sidecar to a chain or an existing DAO in order to benefit from, you know, all the things that it provides?
Both is possible. So you can either like build your full DAO on Q and then bridge for execution to another chain or into the application, but you could also just use certain aspects, like for example this code upgrading. You can build your DAO on another chain. You can have all of the internal DAO mechanisms on another chain, but then only use that one feature where you use Q as the external governance security anchor, and just bridge over to Q for this one feature and then back for enforcement. So there are variants of how to do that. How we, like in real life, there are 2 ways of integrating. We have standard, 3 standard products at the moment, which is treasury oversight, code upgrades without admin keys, and expert decision oversight, which I explained. You can have a proposal on chain, put down or put forth all of the relevant infra that we need, and then the Q token holders may make a decision whether to integrate with you. So that's a standard process, or many times we still do bespoke integrations, especially with bigger ones, and the layer 2 or layer 1 would definitely be as bespoke integration.
In the case of, let's say, like I'm just thinking here, like in the case of a Cosmos chain, let's say you had a Cosmos chain that wanted to outsource parts of its governance to Q.
Yeah.
If the execution is done on the chain, and I guess this also would apply to an L2, or maybe not an Ethereum contract, because here, as long as it's like, if it's application specific and you have your own set of validators, I think this would apply. But basically, like, a decision could be made on Q, and then it has to send, like, the decision has to be settled on the chain. At that point, potentially the validators of that chain could collude to not execute the decision, or like, would Q even work in that case? Like, how does it enforce things happening on another settlement layer?
So on the on that level, most probably, like with some chains, that would require an integration with Q and the chain. So the chain would, like we have. I mean, we have the governance on top of a DPoS chain, and the integration is such that, for example, root nodes are able to take out rogue validators from consensus in order to remain the integrity of the chain. You know?
Yeah.
So
but that's on the Q chain.
That's on the Q chain. So an integration with Q, depending on how deep you want to go, that could be one way to do that. For example, by way of slashing. So a layer 1 could integrate with Q for the slashing. So we do non-deterministic slashing. Just did another one a couple of days ago, which is not only much fairer to the validators, but is much more sustainable. Yeah, like we talked about, like efficiency, capital efficiency. So staking and slashing could be used. You always need this external governance security anchor, and you always need the ability to do non-deterministic things, and then you can integrate like on many levels. For applications where this has not happened, then we would plug into what's ever happening on the application.
Okay. Taking a step back here and looking at the bigger picture, there's all sorts of narratives I think that are prevalent in this space right now. There's this idea of network states, which I think this kind of fits nicely into. There's also a really big topic, which is AI, and people are discussing and concerned about how we will govern AI and prevent sort of doomsday scenarios that people seem to be worried about. How does Q fit into all these ideas, and how can Q benefit in a future where increasingly things are governed online and not necessarily in sort of like the physical meat space? Contracts may be concluded purely on an on-chain basis and not necessarily in physical jurisdictions.
Network states is a super interesting one, because a second background to Q was at the time when we started with the concept. We were working with a couple of really early Bitcoin investors on a free state concept, and so I was writing.
Oh, I think I know who that is.
I was writing a constitution, and we were so the early concepts of Q were designing a governance system for that, and then at some point we said like, well, this could be good for everyone and for all kinds of applications. So that's when we kind of spun it out, and that's where we received our initial seed funding, and that's how, like, one of the reasons we do Q, because that nation state, or like network state, today you wouldn't call it network state, free state, principle was behind that. And of course, I mean, with everything that is a network state or close to, you will need some kind of integrated, comprehensive governance framework, because you want to have it independent of other nation states. So that's another fundamental concept that not many have understood. Everything nation state based is region based. All the laws, everything is only because there is a region with people and they define what they want to do. If you have a world or an economy or ecosystem, whatnot, that is independent of region, you can think about completely new ways of designing and laws. It's like and also ecosystems and interactions. You don't have to have like one country. There's right now a discussion that's worrying me a lot around DAOs, which comes out of this initiative in Wyoming with this new Dune framework. And it's not that I don't like the idea and the framework. What I really worry about is this discussion where there is a voice saying like, well, we need to put all of these DAOs into this framework, which is really dangerous, I believe, because it's essentially saying like, let's Americanize all DAOs. It's designed in order to, what was put forth as the reasons, it's like, we need to have a legal jurisdiction. We talked about this before, for something that's really decentralized. No, maybe not. Maybe yes for certain things, but as a basis, no, we don't. Then it's important to pay taxes. Well, that might be the case in the United States, but I know a little bit about taxes in Germany and Europe. Those are very different concepts. So I don't agree with the US tax system at all. It's American imperialism, which I don't agree with as a principle in itself, not only because it's America. I love America. I lived there. I have my best friends are Americans. But I don't agree with that. And then there's a whole world of discussion around like taxation. It's like, if I use a decentralized system and I pay governance fees and transaction fees, I'm paying taxes, essentially. Why do I have to pay taxes in the US for everything else again? There's no double tax treaty, and like all of these kind of things. And then at the end of the day, I don't like the idea to have a decentralized world reside in Wyoming, all of it. That doesn't make sense, right? That is a really worrying discussion I see at the moment, coming back to network states, where I believe network states need to be independent. And there are all kinds of different ways we can define the laws of a network state, because the initial foundations will be interest rather than region. It could be whatever, but not region. So we will have to come up with a lot more sophisticated, novel ideas to do that. The other way is AI. I really see a very strong case for decentralized AI. I mean, this discussion around like open AI that's apparently not that open anymore, and then Elon Musk, who's a big proponent of open systems, at least that's what he's saying, and open sourcing his XI startup and so forth. So if we want to have a decentralized AI space, if we believe there's benefit to having AI decentralized, which I definitely do, we will have to have a decentralized governance for that.
Yeah.
And in very simple terms, we will have to have a mechanism to define the scope of discretion within which the AI can play freely. We will have to have a mechanism to define how that scope of discretion can change if certain external factors appear or the AI evolves or whatever. And we will have to have an ultimate human backstop. And especially the last one has to be decentralized. I would not want to see this in the hands of a person, a group of people, a government, or any kind of institution. I will want to have that as decentralized as we could possibly dream it up, but still involving humans, because you cannot code governance of that sophistication. It's simply impossible. So I very strongly, as you can hear, I have a very strong position on we do need decentralized AI. Why do I feel strongly about the decentralized space as such, or decentralization? Decentralization is not a benefit or merit in itself. It serves a purpose. And for me, the purpose is freedom. It's very simple. So freedom means to have a choice. So far, we did not have a choice to design systems, businesses, society in any other way than in a centralized way. We couldn't. So blockchain and crypto has given us an alternative. And that's how I look at it. It's all about alternatives. That's why we need a truly decentralized space. This is why I feel very strongly about DeFi. I'm very frustrated with DeFi at the moment. It's the killer application, and it's going nowhere. And I know I will provoke a lot of eyebrows raised, but I really see it that way.
Why do you think it's going nowhere?
Have we seen any relevant innovation after this crazy, amazing first wave of innovation of DeFi?
I mean,
I haven't
you're
really.
talking about like the innovation that are decentralized lending markets and decentralized exchanges. Yeah.
So like all of the really big DeFi or like finance schemes like pensions or insurance, this is the big game.
Yeah.
This is the real stuff. So no, nothing. I mean, literally no movement at all. There's a lot of reflexive demand in it, and they're not so much organic demand. It's all like in itself, and the reason is because it cannot evolve in a more substantial or sophisticated way. It's very centralized at times, which is scary to people. So that's why a lot of people are not starting to use it, and especially not bigger institutions, which we would definitely need and could have. And so that's one. Then that we've talked about this at length, like binary decision making is simply not good enough. It's not enough. So as long as we stick to that, we will not see any innovation. And then if you still believe that a governance token within the system can protect the system, come on. I mean, we know where these governance tokens came from originally. There's no other place in the world where that works. You know, the governance is always smaller or of lesser value than the actual business. Otherwise, the business can never grow. You know, if the governance always has to be more valuable than the actual business in order to protect it, the business cannot grow. It's very obvious.
Yeah, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about the stake necessary. I think what Q enables is it enables governance not to be tied to market cap. It enables governance not to be tied to the economics of a protocol, and and that's essentially like how governance has existed and functioned in companies forever, right? Like but that requires a shift, I think, in the way a lot of people think about governance in crypto, which is the enforcement is not economic. The enforcement is, well, at the end of the day, the enforcement is violence, right? So like, I think that's it's violence in the sense that, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. At the end of the day, the enforcement comes, you know, from the guy with the gun, right? Who will ultimately enforce when a legal jurisdiction makes an enforcement. I mean, that's the basis for sort of legal enforcement, right? You always at the end, you always have someone who's going to like, what do you call it?
It
grab your wrist and like enforce you. Right?
Yeah, on a football pitch could be a referee. That's the
correct, right?
You know?
And so I think that in the blockchain world, that's a concept that is frowned upon by a lot of folks for ideological reasons, philosophical reasons, what have you, right? There's like this libertarian route in crypto that I think like bleeds into a lot of the philosophies and ideas about how protocols should be run. And I think that the libertarian philosophy in crypto does also, you know, empower this idea that things should be governed on chain with binary decisions, because by doing that, you remove the violence aspect. So I think that that's where that comes from. But it's necessary if you want to have a functioning system that isn't reliant solely on economics, solely on on the financial strength of a blockchain, for instance, in the case of Aragon, right, where the governance token is worth less than the thing that it's actually governing. And that's something I think about a lot. We've gone super long here. We've gone way over time, but I think this is a super fascinating conversation. We could go on for hours. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And where can people go to learn more about Q and potentially even get involved, you know, run a root node, run a validator, start building a DAO on the system?
Q.org.
Easy.
That's easy. That's where you find us. And from there, you can find hq.q.org, which is the DApp. And from there, you can look at the actual online governance. You can participate in governance. And you can get a couple of Q tokens from the faucet, and to really start playing around, you can participate in all kinds of incentives that we're running at the moment, or look out for the Q token to be available on bigger exchanges sometime in the future.
Great. Nicolas, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being there. And thanks for the awesome questions. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Cheers.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.